In this panel, I'm talking to Ivan Lewis and Jake Wallis-Simons. So Jake Wallis-Simons is the editor of the Jewish Chronicle and author of the book Israelophobia. Ivan Lewis was a UK Member of Parliament for over 20 years, Minister for the Middle East, and also just General Minister for 9 years. So let's just jump straight in. There's been rampant anti-Semitism in the UK, but especially in London in the past recent weeks. I mean, Jake, on your social media, and particularly, you've highlighted quite a few different videos and quite a few different things that's been happening, and incidents that's been happening in London. And it's so hard to even watch them. I mean, I've tried watching them, but some of them it's just so disgusting to actually what's happening there. What's your thoughts of everything that's happening?
Well, I think for a long time we believed that this stuff was kind of over in Britain. By we, I mean not me personally, but I think society. You know, editing the Jewish Chronicle um, is a position that attracts a lot of criticism from all sides at once, as you could probably imagine. One Jew, three criticisms, and but two of the main criticisms that I've faced, that the paper has faced, has been number one, that we've been focusing too much on anti-Semitism, on the Iranian threat, on hate preachers, on jihadism, and so forth. And number two, that we're too right wing. And on the second point, I mean, we're not too right wing. We have many left wing columnists. In fact, we probably have more left wing columnists than right wing columnists, but it's a perception. And I feel that since October the 7th, both of those criticisms have been entirely vindicated, because we've been shown to be right to focus on the threat of anti-Semitism in our country. Of course, it's right to celebrate British culture, British Jewish culture. It's right to celebrate all the wonderful positivity that we have in the British Jewish community, and how lucky we are to be here, and how vibrant and colourful and warm it is. But we've also been focusing sharply on the anti-Semitic threat, which hitherto has been largely subterranean, but since October the 7th has burst into the open. And in terms of the left-right divide, we have no political affiliation at all. But it's noticeable, isn't it, that since October the 7th, all of the voices in the mainstream discourse standing up for Jews and standing up for Israel have been on the political right. I mean, I'm not talking about the leadership. Obviously, Keir Starmer has been a powerful support for Israel and for British Jews. I'm not discounting that at all, and on the front bench as well. But what I'm talking about is in the media and on social media. How many commentators? In fact, we tried to do a feature at the Jewish Chronicle of non-Jews who stuck up for Jews in the media, and we couldn't do it because they were all on the right. I mean, it seemed as if we were a right-wing paper. And so I think that people have had to, over the last few weeks, we're all still coming to terms with the new reality. As Bret Stephens wrote in the New York Times recently, for the Jewish community, every day is now October the 8th. Things have changed. It was a game-changing moment, and we're all still coming to terms with it. But I think as a community, we're having to look long and hard at ourselves and at the assumptions that we previously held that led us into a unified state of, I would say, complacency, complicit with the wider culture and politics and our security establishment as well. And you mentioned my book, which I'll show you the cover of it, Israelophobia. I mean, it came out on September the 7th, 1 month to the day before October the 7th. And it described in detail how the newest form of anti-Semitism has become Israelophobia. And it described in detail how it's captured many parts of our society, particularly on the left. And since October the 7th, that has all been sadly proven not only to be true, but much more urgent and serious and alarming than even I thought.
What's your thoughts?
Well, I agree with much of what Jake said. I suppose we can't kind of ignore the Corbyn era. I think the Corbyn era was a wake-up call to many British Jews, a belated wake-up call. I think it unified the Jewish community. It gave the leadership of the community a voice that it hadn't had for a long time. The complacency around always having a friendly figure in number 10 Downing Street that would rescue the community if there were difficulties. Suddenly all of that was in peril. So it's probably worth reflecting on that. But I still think Jake's right, because I think it's very uncomfortable for those of us who have functioned perhaps at a reasonably positive level in British society, who want to believe that this is not endemic and institutional. It's much easier for us to try and pretend it's not as bad as it appears, if you like to be apologists. And the truth is, Jake's right, what we've seen since the 7th of October is truly shocking. What it's reaffirmed, of course, is that through the ages, there have been different forms of anti-Semitism, which have been represented through different medium. There is no question contemporary anti-Semitism is largely through the prism of anti-Zionism. There can be no question about that. And part of the problem is we also became apologetic about the word Zionist, and we allowed our opponents and our enemies to define what Zionism isn't, which is some aggressive entity that seeks to take over other people and impose power on people who don't want us. We didn't fight for the argument, frankly, that Zionism is the right to self-determination for Jewish people, in the same way as all these people on the left are very happy to march through the streets for the right to self-determination for every conceivable minority that exists around the world. There is only one minority they seem to have a major problem with in terms of the right to self-determination. I also think that there is a sort of blind spot on the left about the notion of a just war. My grandfather, as it so happens, fought in the Spanish Civil War as a teenager. He fought for the International Brigade against Franco's fascism. He was a communist. He said, if we don't defeat Franco's fascists, that fascism will spread throughout Europe. Him and his generation were derided for holding that view, and of course they were absolutely right. But the point I'm making is these were guys on the left who fought in a war that was absolutely nothing to do with them, but it was a matter of great principle. And then, unfortunately, my grandfather subsequently died, ironically, having survived Spain in the Second World War. So the other issue is that if you are not a pacifist, you have to be prepared to engage in a debate about what a just war is. And if there was ever a just war, it's the war that Israel finds itself fighting as we speak here this evening. And for the left to be in denial about that is truly shocking. They're the very same people, by the way, who will attend Holocaust education events on an annual basis around the country, whether it be in schools or in town halls, where the phrase that everybody uses is never again. Well, babies were found in ovens on October the 7th in Israel. That's what happened. So never again, frankly, if it was meant, the series of events that we've experienced, it should have meant something, and it means absolutely or sadly very little to large numbers of people. Now, I suppose what we've always got to do is have an element of perspective. So the fact that, well, the numbers are what, between 300 and 500 million, depending on who you believe, in terms of those who marched at the weekend in London. 300 and 500,000. Not that many, 300 and 500,000. The truth is, of course, that there is a significant majority of British people who basically are not sure about this conflict, and maybe are not engaged in this conflict. But the sheer scale of these marches is truly horrifying. And there is a complete failure to recognise why there is a war in the first place. The nature of the people that Israel are fighting against, that this is a war that defines, are you on the side of good or are you on the side of evil? And what's quite shocking is there are large numbers of British people who are very happy to identify themselves as being on the side of evil. So it is, as Jake said, a massive wake-up call. And of course, what it does is it first of all reinforces the need to build alliances with those who are our friends and our supporters. But it also reinforces the fact that, thankfully, Jews through history can never really trust anybody else to be custodians of their destiny or their salvation. And unfortunately, that's an awful thing to have to say. But what we're seeing playing out, not just in this country, by the way, but in large swathes of the world, I'm afraid to say reinforces that point. And while all of that's going on, in my view, the Israeli government, the IDF, are genuinely trying to fight a war which is sensitive to humanitarian considerations. You would have it believed that the Israelis are just bombing wherever they want to. They don't care about the human consequences. They don't care about the loss of civilian life. Nothing could be further from the truth in terms of the strategy that Israel is adopting. Corridors being created, giving people notice, telling people where to go,
7 hours
protecting
break a day.
7 hours a day break, protecting people, taking them to safety. And all the time, the evidence mounting that what we've said, over many years, that Hamas hides in hospitals and schools and centers of civilian population, it's just the evidence is overwhelming about hospitals, for example. Now it's beyond any doubt, and you have respectable media organizations talking about. The Gazan Health Department said today, here's the number of casualties that we've experienced. The Gazan Health, they make it sound like the National Health Service.
Well, to be fair, the BBC do write the Gaza Health Ministry, which is run by Hamas.
Yeah,
they always write that.
But so what? Okay, the point is that they are propagandists, right? And they are participants in this war. So I think what Jake was saying really is that we cannot any longer underestimate the scale of the problem that we face, and the days of complacency need to be put long behind us.
I think, just to tease out a couple of the things that you were covering, the thing that stood out was when you said that so many people are have chosen to march on the side of evil, and I think that the fascinating thing about anti-Semitism in general as a phenomenon, including its morphing into what I call Israelophobia, but is anti-Semitism, it's just focusing on Israel, is that the anti-Semites have never, ever had the ability to look into their own hearts and to see what's been going on. They've always felt that however noxious and racist they are when seen through our eyes, when they look at themselves, they feel they're on the side of the angels. They're doing a good thing. During the medieval times, they were, expelling, marginalizing, torturing Jews, forcing them to convert because it was God's work in some way. They were the Christ killers, and it felt like it was a virtuous, godly thing. When during the Second World War, the Jews were this malignant, subversive, subhuman race who were bringing disaster on the world and causing wars and so forth. And so the logical conclusion was to exterminate them for the good of the world. And now they feel they're on the right side of history as well. In fact, some of them have actually said that explicitly. And it's worth examining that, I think, how that's happening right now. And as I've said, it does seem, aside from the Muslim community here, who have their own reasons, or shall I rephrase that, the parts of the Muslim community that are Israelophobic, which is not all of the Muslim community, they have their own reasons perhaps for being that way, for thinking that. But aside from that, the broader political left, I think, is really where Israelophobia, anti-Semitism has gained a foothold. And I think we need to recognize that. I think for many Jews who are from the left, it's been a really sobering, difficult experience these past few weeks because people have felt they've been profoundly rejected from their political home. And we've seen that, the hard left in particular, not so much, again, I'm excluding the parliamentary party from this and certainly the front bench. So don't get me wrong. I'm not saying that the whole left is anti-Semitic, but I'm saying that the left has been infected by this new strain of anti-Semitism. And it comes because the harder you go to the hard left, the more likely you are to ally with jihadism. Because jihadis are seen as a symbol of resistance against Western imperialism and against colonialism, and now against white supremacy as well. They're seen as freedom fighters. And, Islamism, the jihadism, is really a modern thing. It's not a traditional heritage of Islam. it arose really in the last 100, 200 years largely from Western thought and ideology that's linked to the hard left, the thought of hard left philosophers and existentialists and so forth. It's really a sort of Leninist philosophy. It's got a sort of hard left flavour of its own, and there's this synergy of people like Corbyn, who called Hamas and Hezbollah, let's not forget, his friends, visited them both in Lebanon, worked for Iranian press TV. He is an exemplar of that trend. And Jews are feeling so isolated, I think, on the left from their political home. I got a message just the other day from somebody saying, and I can almost quote it from memory. She said, an old university friend of mine saying, "Dear Jake, I'm sorry I defriended you on Facebook all those years ago. When you went to work for the Daily Mail, I thought you'd gone off the rails. Now I'm eating my words." I think a lot of people feel that way. She's not on the right. She's politically homeless now. And I think it's a really troubling time for Jews, particularly on the left.
I think that's true. I mean, I'm obviously of the centre left myself, and I think that we look at what John Landsman said, the founder of Momentum, only this week. So the guy who found the left-wing organisation within Labour that promoted Corbyn and kept Corbyn there and all the rest of it, he himself said that he could no longer march against these kind of people, and they had a real problem with Jews. So for John Landsman to feel that he ultimately... Sorry.
I was just going to say, John Landsman's interview in the New Statesman was really quite extraordinary.
It wasn't.
As you were saying, he stood up for the right of a just war and the justness of a just war, and he did not.
Sure, it is extreme. Yeah, and it shows you how he's been made to feel, because in the end, he was one of the left. I mean, he was one of the leaders of the left. So he ultimately, long after people like me had to choose between his identity, his religious or cultural identity, and his political bedfellows. Right now, some of us had to make that choice, unfortunately, a long time ago when Corbyn arrived on the scene. But even he's now had to make that choice. I would make one point about Keir Starmer. I think it's probably fair to say that because of what Jake said about the left, it is even more difficult for Keir Starmer to have adopted the position that he's adopted. So he does deserve some credit for this. It is relevant to make the point because I think we all have to be realistic. It looks to me as though there's going to be a Labour government in Britain, and it's very difficult to see how that's not going to happen. The idea that David Cameron, by the way, is the solution to that not happening is quite interesting. But so it's very important that Keir Starmer be recognised for the fact holding the line when the left has had this position is something that he deserves credit for.
Well, let me ask you a question on that.
Because I think it's not just about Keir Starmer, by the way. The point I would make is it's a test of leaders everywhere. It's a real test of the strength and the integrity of leadership. So in many countries and many societies, Jews are a minority. And there are others who have a different view who are a majority. Francis is an example of all of that. Okay. And so what people say is, well, you have to understand that leaders in the end have got all these pressures on them and they've got to be aware of the wider population. They can't expect them to stand up for Jews. I actually no longer am prepared to make excuses for leaders. This is a time to show moral authority, to actually be clear about where one's moral compass is. And leaders who are unwilling and unable to do that, whoever they are, deserve our criticism, in my view.
Okay, so let me ask you a question on that. So you have had a lot of experience as a minister in the Labour Party. So as you see what's happening right now with so many councillors and so many people in the Labour Party really pushing, say, Keir Starmer to call for a ceasefire and to retract for some of his comments, how do you see that?
Well, it doesn't come as any surprise to me. I mean, the Labour Party, when I was a minister, a member of Parliament, was largely during the era of certainly a minister was Tony Blair, then Gordon Brown, where we had very strong advocates and supporters in number 10 Downing Street. Ed Miliband, perhaps it was more difficult. And then obviously Corbyn came along, and that was a game changer. But what I would say is that it is very important that we bolster our friends, wherever they are, on the left or the right, that we embolden them, that we strengthen them, and that they hold the course. So my attitude to this would be that at the moment, am I surprised about what Labour councillors, Labour activists, the pressure that they're applying to Keir Starmer and the Labour leadership, the shadow cabinet? I'm not surprised in the slightest. I think it does show that the moderates are genuinely in charge and in control of the Labour Party these days. I think there are many Jewish voters, by the way, who are extremely concerned about this. There are many sophisticated Jewish voters who can see the almost likelihood, let's say, and that's an inevitability, I shouldn't say inevitability in politics, the likelihood of a Labour government, and always say to me, well, of course we can live with Keir Starmer. Of course we think he's okay. But what about these other guys lurking behind the scenes? Isn't there a real risk they will take back the Labour Party? Now, my honest view about that is that it's a much wider group of people than just the leadership. The Labour Party now is in the hands of moderates, and that is very, very important. But beyond the Labour Party, beyond the left in this country, as I say, this is a test of moral authority. It's a test of Joe Biden. It's so far so good. How long will he last the course? Because in the past, in previous conflicts, you wake up one morning and suddenly the American administration has issued a statement saying Israel must stop. That presents all sorts of problems in Jerusalem, whether Jews want to admit this, because they often say, we don't need America, we don't need anybody, we don't need to listen to them. It's simply not kind of reality, it's not real world. So we also have to look at leaders across the world, and we have to ask the question, will they hold the course? And we have to hope that they'll hold the course.
But I think that I agree with everything that you're saying. But I think that there are also many people in the Jewish community who, although they admire Keir Starmer's stance is actually his stance now on Israel, but also his stance on anti-Semitism until now, where he's been rooting it out, as he, in his own words, tearing it out by the root. He has been forceful and effective in that in the parliamentary party at the very least. But I think for a lot of Jews, it's still difficult to shake the knowledge and the memory of the Corbyn years, when Keir was the longest serving member of Corbyn's shadow cabinet and campaigned hard, including on national television, to try to get him into number 10. And we know that if there had been a parallel universe in which Corbyn had, God forbid, been elected on the 12th of December 2019, we're confident. I mean, I think most people are would probably accept that Keir Starmer would have served on his front bench as Home Secretary or whatever, Attorney General, whatever he was going to be, or Chancellor. So I think that is in the back of many people's minds even now. And to give Keir Starmer full credit, as you do, he's done a fantastic job with rooting out anti-Semitism. He's done a fantastic job with standing up against the voices in his party that are calling for him to break with Israel and to call for a ceasefire and to rescind from UK support for Israel. He's done a brilliant job in those ways. But at the same time, it feels to many people that it's a political calculation, that he knows that elections are won from the centre ground, not from the left, and that this is the anti-Semitism and Israel are two key issues which are allowing him to pivot and show that the Labour Party is electable, to evoke the Blair years, to bring it back to the centre and to appeal to the wider electorate. And so I think that the question mark in many people's mind still remains over how much of this is because of his values and how much of it is because of political expediency.
Yeah, Jake, you actually mentioned at the beginning, which I like to pick up on. You mentioned about the Jewish Chronicle. You said that whenever you post something, or a lot of people post something, it generally gets to be quite controversial. The other day, Douglas Murray posted something in the Jewish Chronicle, which happened to. I'm sure you saw how controversial that was. Can you just give a bit of explanation for people who don't know what it is, and just what your thoughts are on it?
Sure. So, I mean, the background is that, as I said, the Jewish Chronicle is not politically aligned. And we're really not the only paper in the community, but we're the biggest and the oldest, and we have a certain responsibility. And so for that reason,
As a Jewish Telegraph columnist, I'm glad you corrected the statement you just made.
And we have a very
Tongue-in-cheek.
wide range of columnists, much wider than any other paper. So, for example, in one edition, 1 week, we can have Jonathan Friedland writing and Melanie Phillips writing in the same paper, for example. Or we could have, Ruth Smith, who's one of our columnists, who's a Labour peer, and and Douglas Murray, who's obviously from the right. So I make it intentionally a very broad synagogue, I suppose you could say, rather than a broad church. And Douglas Murray doesn't write for us very often. He's not one of my regular columnists, but from time to time, I think the last time we had him was about 18 months ago, a couple of years ago. But now he's been very, very vocal about Israel, and he's in Israel on the Gaza border at the moment, reporting from there, writing from there. And he wrote us a column which, on the whole, was, as you'd imagine, very supportive of Israel, condemnatory of the people who are complacent in this country about anti-Semitism. But in it, there are a couple of lines in which he said that, in his opinion, the relish that Hamas showed in the slaughter and the glee and the way in which they filmed it and wanted to display it and broadcast it was something that he hadn't even seen in the Nazis, in Nazi behavior. And that was the point that he made. It was quite only a couple of lines in an overall column, but that caused people to decide that he was a neo-Nazi because he was minimizing Nazi crimes. He was making excuses for Nazis. And the way he talks about some SS men who were troubled by their consciences and got drunk in the night to forget and so forth. But it was only a couple of lines. But people felt that this was really beyond the pale and it was outrageous. So it precipitated a huge Twitter storm in the style of 2023. These things, rather than being debated soberly, caused this great inflammatory reaction, which was very unfortunate. And I've got to say, I read his column, and when I got to that bit, I did think about it. I thought, that's a bit funny. I'm not sure that matches with history, but it was only a couple of lines. I just sort of moved on. But I never thought for a moment he was minimizing the Nazi Holocaust, because I know that he's not a Holocaust revisionist, and so I know that wasn't what he could have meant. So anyway, so that became a Twitter storm. There's a lot of Twitter storms at the moment because tempers are high and emotions are high and passions are high. And so that was that unfortunate episode, which distracted everybody from the main. I mean, people were calling his column heinous. I mean, a couple of lines like that. I mean, what's heinous was October the 7th.
Correct.
Lines that were maybe ill-advised or controversial or provocative about Nazis, whatever. That's not heinous. October the 7th was heinous. This whole thing has been a big distraction that I really regret.
Yeah, I think Jake's right. We as a community fight very hard not to allow anybody to compare virtually any event in history with the Holocaust. We fight like mad to ensure that doesn't happen, because it really worries us when people attempt to do so. I think that, however, Douglas Murray has been the most amazing advocate, really, in his effectiveness, both for Israel and for the Jewish community in recent times. And therefore, maybe it was ill-advised, but to then attack him personally and to make sweeping generalizations about him is in my opinion, he doesn't share my politics, but it's complete nonsense.
I think he doesn't share. I mean, there are many points of difference between my politics.
Sure.
I'm in many ways more moderate than him in various different areas of debate. But I think that people saw an opportunity to take him down and take the Jewish Chronicle down at the same time. And so it was a sweet spot for a lot of people, I think. But not only detractors, also friends piled on. I think it really inflamed people, and I really regret that it did.
Yeah, I mean, to be balanced about all of this, we were talking about Keir Starmer, and Jake was talking about the combination of what one's values and one's desire to present yourself in a particular way politically. I have to say, Keir Starmer would not be unique in that respect. I think he'd probably be comparable to any political leader in history. So I would say it's a combination, to be fair to him, of his values and also his desire.
I mean, I just to interrupt briefly, I'm not sure. I mean, I hear what you're saying, and you're right. Political opportunism and expediency is hardly limited to one politician. It's rife across politics by necessity. But there are principled politicians, and you are one, and Ian Austin is one, and there are others on the Labour front benches and in Parliament on the whole, which during the Corbyn period stood up and refused to follow this man. And if there were more people like that, particularly on the front bench sitting on the shadow front bench, then Corbyn would not have been able to get as close as he did.
Okay, so we need to talk about that's the past. I'm talking about the current position that the leadership of the party is adopting. The question for me is, it's very important that they want to be a centre ground moderate party entering government. It's very important that they say that what they want to be. It's important for society and for the country, and it's also important for the Jewish community. So that's virtuous. It's not a criticism. And does it chime with his values? Do I really think he is morally offended by what Hamas did on October. Of course, Keir Starmer is mortifully offended. So I would say that. But I would go on to say, I think we're extremely fortunate as well, to have Rishi Sunak and his conduct throughout this affair. We've had the reshuffle today. We might touch on that in a moment.
We're going to touch on that.
But he has been absolutely rock solid, and has gone out of his way really to at every point empathise, show solidarity, articulate why the stakes are so high, why this is not just about supporting Jews, but it's also about the national interest. And he deserves tremendous credit for that too. So I don't want to give the impression as somebody who, instinctively was of the left till Mr. Corbyn came along that I'm apologising for some of the things that shouldn't have been done in the past. I just want to make that point as well. It's very, although we are horrified by the number of people marching down the streets of London every weekend, we need to be we are very fortunate at the behaviour of our political class in terms of political leaders for the duration of this crisis so far. And I think we should say that. It's very important.
Yeah, I agree.
You mentioned the reshuffle, so let's just talk about that. So, it's hard to miss that one out. So today there was a reshuffle where Suella Braverman left the cabinet and was replaced and then David Cameron joined. It was quite a lot of reshuffle. Even the Conservative Party chairman left as well. What's all of your thoughts on this?
So I would say that, first of all, that the problem is that what Suella Braverman sort of said is borne out by what happened in the first set of demonstrations in London, where, frankly, there were no arrests, there was no holding to account people chanting slogans that were unlawful, and there was a great sense that the police had surrendered the streets to people who were breaking the law, not people who were exercising freedom of speech. So there was a great deal of frustration, I think, in the community and wider about why the police had allowed that to happen. And I think in her article, she was reflecting that to some extent. That sense of not that people don't have the right to march, not that they don't have the right to have strong views, but they'd crossed the line, and frankly, the police hadn't dealt with them in the way that they should have done. However, and the however is this: as Home Secretary, you obviously have to have the confidence of the police. And if it is perceived that you have lost the confidence of the police, it becomes quite difficult. I don't totally understand. I understand the David Cameron appointment in terms of the 24-hour, 48-hour, 72-hour news cycle, because it becomes the big story. So rather than Suella Braverman, the split in the Tory party, the Tory right's reaction to Suella Braverman being sacked, the story becomes David Cameron is back, and David Cameron's back with a big job. My only doubt about the story is David Cameron, the David Cameron that left office, an asset to the Conservative Party? Not the David Cameron that for much of the time as Prime Minister achieved quite a significant level of popularity. Let's be frank about it. I say that as a former Labour minister. But the David Cameron that left office is a man who is seen to have left this country in a complete mess because of Brexit. That's not about whether you were for or against Brexit. It's just that that's the basis on which he left office. So I don't think David Cameron will help the Tory party's position in the polls.
Do you not think he's at least more popular than Suella Braverman, at least for the Labour people?
So, well, he doesn't really need to worry too much about the left and their attitude to Suella Braverman, because none of them are ever going to vote Tory, whether it's David Cameron or Suella Braverman. But the point is, what Cameron does is he brings a statesman to a very important role. At the end of the day, he's a former Prime Minister. The world is a very dangerous place. We're focusing exclusively tonight on, quite rightly, on Israel's war, but there's also Russia-Ukraine. There's what's the world going to do about Iran, which might, by the way, should be the big question we're asking ourselves very soon. Once this war is over, or as this war is going on, is the world going to get real about Iran? So Cameron is a statesman because he's a former Prime Minister. Now, some people will say, no, he was a lightweight, he wasn't a great Prime Minister. But at the end of the day, he held the office of Prime Minister in this country for quite a considerable period of time. So does that bolster the reputation of the Conservative Party for competence and credibility as you move into a very, very important election? And what Rishi Sunak will hope is he'll be able to say, look at this team of people I've got around me, people of experience, people can deal with the big challenges that the country and the world faces. My own view is that David Cameron doesn't bring with him anymore that positive brand.
Yeah, I think I agree with a lot of what you've said. I think that what what we've seen happening is the Prime Minister thinking about the next election, obviously, and getting Cameron in place. I think will help to, in his mind anyway, to lure back the blue wall. You know, the Tory voters in the shires who are largely Remainer, who are not, who would hemorrhage from the party under Boris. And under the direction of the party since Boris took over, to court them and bring them back with the figure of Cameron to reassure them that they can return, and it's going to be bright blue moderate conservatism. But I think that what's been lost in this is the point that Suella Braverman was making in the first place, which is the one that relates to us, which is that there is this problem with a softness towards jihadism in this country and a support for jihadism in this country, which the police are not taking seriously and which nothing is being done to stop. And that's a serious national security problem, and the Jews are first in the firing line. We've seen week after week on our streets slogans glorifying Hamas, glorifying murder at marches that have been organised by people with links to Hamas who have met the Hamas leadership in Gaza. We've seen these marches followed every single week by sermon after sermon in radical mosques up and down the country, in which the acts of terror are glorified and more is called for. The police are not engaging with that with anything like the alacrity that they showed with regard to the far right last weekend, or indeed the way in which they handled the anti-lockdown protesters during lockdown, or indeed the women who attended the Sarah Everard vigil, which they brutally suppressed, as a result had to pay compensation to two of the women who they had arrested. So they clearly are being soft on this problem, which affects us first and the rest of the country next, in the same way as they're soft on other trendy causes like Black Lives Matter and so on and so forth. This is a problem, and that problem doesn't go away by sacking Suella Braverman. The Prime Minister's used this opportunity to pivot towards the election, to appeal to the Tory shires, to steady the ship and try desperately to claw victory back from the gaping jaws of defeat. But at this all this while, our real concern about Jewish security and the values of our country, which are being assailed by this extremism and jihadism, which is not endemic throughout the whole Muslim community, but is on our streets week after week, that's being forgotten.
Okay, moving on to the next question. Someone sent this in, and I think it's actually a very good question. He said, do you see there being a realistic chance of peace between the various communities in the near future?
Which, in Britain or?
In Britain, yeah. Right. Jake, what do you think?
Peace between the communities,
between different communities, Muslim, Jewish.
Well, I think underlying, what we're seeing now is is the effects of a problem that's built up over a long time, since the Blair years and even slightly before, where different the level of migration has gone up a lot, and different communities have developed around the country, which have been siloed from each other, and we've at the same time become convinced with the rise of identity politics that we're all endemically racist, and that we live in a racist country. And so we've got to a point where we're undoing ourselves. We no longer have a national story to tell of British identity that we feel we can be proud of and share with first generation, second generation immigrants, and bind us all together in a unified national spirit. And so I think because of that, what we've seen in the protests over the last weekend and before, they haven't just been attacking Israel and Jews. They've been attacking symbols of Britishness, the Union flag, the cenotaph, the statue of Churchill, and so on. The movement of sympathy for Hamas and for the Palestinians is an anti-Western, anti-imperialist, anti-colonialist, anti-white supremacist stance. It attacks the mainstream British values as much as it attacks Jewish principles in society as well. And so there's a big tension, I think, a cultural tension within our country and the wider West. And we badly need to try to win the confidence of people on that side of the argument, to win the battle of ideas, and to make them feel like this is their country too, and that and to share the sort of values that we share of liberalism and tolerance and and freedom of assembly and speech and all the rest of it. And at the moment, we're not doing that. And I think that once again, we can learn from Israel in this, in a strange sort of sense. I mean, Israel, war-torn Israel at the moment, one of the great, wonderful stories, or I should say, perhaps a glimmer of hope coming out of Israel over the past few weeks has been the attitude of the Israeli Arabs towards the conflict and towards Hamas. On the whole, there's jihadism in Israel, there's extremism there, and so forth. But on the whole, Israeli Arabs have pulled behind Israel in rejecting Hamas and supporting Israel in this hour of darkness in a great many ways. Mansour Abbas, for example, has been very dignified and statesmanlike. He's the leader of the Ram party in Israel, which is an Islamist party. He's a peaceful Islamist, but he's an Islam. He's a conservative Muslim. But he has been very sort of conciliatory and very, very concerned with evoking harmony in the community in Israel, to the extent that when one of his members of Knesset, one of his politicians, last week I think it was, cast doubt on the authenticity of the footage of Hamas atrocities, he sacked her immediately. No, no ifs, no buts, which is much more than Netanyahu did with that minister who called for a nuclear strike on Gaza, by the way. So he has been wonderful, and I think the coherence of Israeli Muslim Arabs within Israeli society and the depth of that has really come out. We've seen Lucia Harish making that wonderful monologue on camera, the news anchor. We've seen even Naz Daily, the social media star, writing that column in Haaretz saying, "I used to be Palestinian Israeli, now I'm Israeli first." We've seen a lot of that. I think Britain actually could learn from that. You can be Muslim, conservative Muslim, just embrace our values. We need to be more confident about communicating that our values are their values too, the universal values. Come with us and stop trying to undermine.
So do you think there can be peace in the near future?
I didn't say that, no. I think it's a big job, isn't it? It's a big job, and it's a huge job, and I think it starts with government and wider culture starting to be confident in our values and confident in asking people to join those values together, because it's right and it's good to believe in liberalism. And I think that we need to start with that confidence and then begin to look at the other social problems of disenfranchisement and poverty and inequality and all the rest of it. So I think it's a big, big job, and it will probably take another prime minister to do.
What do you think? Do you think there could be peace in the near future between different communities?
Well, we live in an area here, don't we, in North Manchester, where we have a large Jewish population, very visible. We have a significant Muslim population, very visible. Now, what one has to acknowledge is that there are neighbours who are still friends. There are people who still walk down the street and say hello to each other. Is there an underlying tension? Yes, there is. Where does the responsibility lie for some of this? It frankly lies with leaders. And we need more courageous leaders in all communities. But I would like to see more Muslim leaders speak out very vociferously against the behaviour of Hamas and jihadists like Hamas. We don't see anywhere near enough of that, because that requires courage, because they're putting themselves at risk of great criticism if they do that. Look, I'm quite cynical and sceptical about the sort of forums where people have bagels and samosas and say, "Isn't it wonderful we all get on?" But the one issue we don't discuss is the Middle East, because it's all too difficult. My view is, well, what's the point? And so I think there's also some questions to be asked about that. We have a Jewish Muslim forum here in Manchester. I think there are. It tries to do some good things, but I think it ducks some of the really fundamental issues and allows people to fulfil leadership roles, by the way, in that forum, who, in my view, their behaviour is totally unacceptable. Whenever there's a conflict, whenever there's a need to choose, those people engage in inflammatory rhetoric and go to the rallies and say all the things that they want to say that appeal to the audience, the anti-Israeli audience, and then when the war's over, they want to come back to having bagels and samosas. Well, I think we have to put more pressure on people like that, people who go and celebrate, by the way, in Manchester, the Iranian Revolution, and then come to Jewish Muslim Forum events and says, let's all be friends. So it's a complex of issues. I actually think we shouldn't be too down on British patriotism. You see, first of all, there's a big difference between integration and assimilation. The two words are completely different. And I think Jake and I would agree that British leadership in the future should have a much more relentless focus on integration and the importance of integration. But we wouldn't support assimilation. And I would also say there's a big difference between patriotism and nationalism. Patriotism is a very healthy thing. And it's something that we should embrace and foster and encourage. And actually, when you have the coronation, when you have the death of the Queen, when you have the Olympics, there is massive opportunities to build that more cohesive, integrated Britain. The question is there a strategic approach to that? And is there a willingness to have some really hard discussions with people? I mean, when I was the minister for the Middle East, I was also minister for Afghanistan and Pakistan when I was in the Foreign Office. And at the end of the day, the Foreign Secretary dealt with the big political issues. So I decided what I was going to do was go around the country and talk to young people about why we're in Afghanistan. In other words, I wasn't really going to be featuring in the big strategic decisions. That was the Foreign Secretary. And it was fascinating. I went to most regions in the country, and I went to lots of university campuses. And I had some very lively debates with young Jews, young Muslims. But the thing that stood out was the way that young Muslims genuinely believed that Western foreign policy is out to get them. It is inherently anti-Islam, it's anti-Muslim. And I was able to throw back all sorts of facts as to why that simply wasn't the case. Okay, but they were strongly of that view. And so if that is only the tip of the iceberg in terms of what many Muslim people in this country have been told, that it's not just about Israel, it's about Western. You see, Israel, as Jake keeps saying, the Corbynites see the West as the enemy. America is the biggest enemy of them all, and Israel is a proxy of America in a region that it doesn't belong, of imperialism, and that's their starting point for this whole debate. The same goes for significant parts of the Muslim community. So it's also a question of taking on some of these arguments and willing to be very, very bullish in addressing the fact that distorted, perverse view of world reality needs challenging because it's not correct. It's not correct that Western foreign policy is anti-Islam. It's simply incorrect. And we need to be more willing to take that on and challenge that than we have been.
So do you think there is a chance for peace, not in just the North Manchester, but in the
What
whole
do we mean by
UK?
peace? There's a chance for people living alongside each other without there being violence. Okay, the word tolerance is used, but is there the scope for mutual respect? Right, that is more challenging and more difficult. I would have expected Muslim leaders to have looked at the events of October the 6th, October the 7th in Israel and been vociferous in the condemnation of what took place. I don't think, I might be wrong, we have seen some Muslim leaders come out in very strong terms. You mentioned political leaders in Israel, you're quite right to mention the courage of one the leader of the Islamist party. But in terms of this country, how many imams, how many lay leaders of the Muslim community have condemned unequivocally, without any caveats, Hamas's conduct? I don't think there's been anywhere near enough.
Yeah, I agree, and I think that partly because October the 7th was with alarming speed passed into the overall picture of the Israel-Palestinian conflict, as if it was some kind of football match. Nothing happens without a context. It arose from the occupation, and so.
Yeah.
And actually, the facts, of course, are that Gaza has not been occupied since 2005. There hasn't been any open-air prison or anything like that. Between 10 and 20,000 Gazans were coming to work in Israel every day through this supposedly closed border. Israel, if it was an open-air concentration camp, then why are you complaining now that the water's been turned off? Hang on, okay, they have been providing water for the last 17 years. So, I think that there's a lot of untruth, a lot of arguments in bad faith, and a lot of ignorance. People just, took the atrocities of Hamas, downplayed their extent, and blamed Israel for it with an appalling speed. Before the blood was even dry, people were protesting outside the embassy here in London. It's outrageous. And
Jake's quite right. Occupation legitimizes any sort of behavior. Well, of course, Gaza wasn't occupied. That's the whole point. In 2005, Israel left Gaza because world opinion said Israel needed to leave, and Israel left. So there was no occupation. This legitimization and excuses is shameful. I spoke to some friends recently who heard people chanting, for example, from the river to the sea. And they approached him and said, which river and which sea? And of course, these guys had no idea which river or which sea they were talking about. Absolutely no idea. So there's also, as Jake rightly says, a tremendous amount of ignorance amongst the people who identify in an emotional way with one side of the argument. If you actually chat, I once had an hour with Corbyn on Israel and anti-Semitism, right? Me, my assistant, and Corbyn. He sat there with a mug of tea. He never, ever responded once to my, I took him through the history, and the facts. He never responded once. And when you actually scratch the surface, his knowledge is so superficial.
I think
It's frightening.
And part of it's because Israel, your position on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, it's become more about you than about the conflict.
Yeah,
It's about your politics and about what a good guy you are. It's sort of
virtuous.
narcissistic in a way, It's a way of pegging your identity. It's a luxury belief. It's one of those things that shows other people what kind of a person you are. It's a marker of elite social status that you're pro-Palestinian, you're pro-trans, you're anti-colonialism, anti-slavery, all the rest of it. It's one of those suite of beliefs that reflect more on ourselves than on the actual authentically held values that we're supposed to have.
Okay, so just moving on to how the media have been portraying it. I mean, what do you think about how the media been portraying Israel? I mean, you're obviously part of the media. You work in the Jewish Chronicle. Technically, I am. But what's your thoughts on all of this? I saw you posted a tweet retweeting. I think it was Elon Levy. We did a podcast with last week, who's spokesperson of Israel, and you said you said it was quite disgusting of what the BBC was saying. I mean, what's all your thoughts on the media?
Well, I mean, that particular video, the BBC interviewer said to him, "Isn't it convenient that whenever Israel hits a hospital, it's because Hamas are there?" So with the sort of implication that the real reason is that you want to hit hospitals and that you're making excuses to allow you to do so, which is totally, totally outrageous. It's not convenient. It's the reason, the only reason why Israel would ever hit a target that has civilians around it is because it has military value, like any other civilized democracy and their armed forces. So I think that overall, I think the broader point I would make is that we're living in a time where pictures of civilian suffering are being weaponized for almost like propaganda, not necessarily by the media consciously, but certainly by Hamas and its allies, who are very, very keen for civilians to get killed, very keen for Israel to be blamed for war crimes. And the way they do that is by pumping out inflated figures, by putting civilians in harm's way, by preventing them forcibly from fleeing from the scenes of the fighting so that they get killed, by not building even a single bomb shelter, by trying as best they can to evoke public anger. They want to get this smear of Israel being genocidal to stick. They want to bring people out onto the streets, as we've seen in London last weekend. In fact, last Friday, the leader of Hezbollah, Hassan Nasrallah, saluted those marching in the West. Thanks, guys. You're doing a great job. Keep going, because the longer you keep it up, the more pressure there is on the political leadership and the less time Israel will have to carry out its operation before the political support that it enjoys fractures. So it's all part of a very, very transparent plot. And the media, I'm afraid, is being played by that agenda. And on top of that, there are some Israelophobic assumptions in many parts of the media that allow it to feel like it instinctively blames Israel for things, even before the dust has settled. For example, that hospital that was hit by the Islamic Jihad rocket. So I think that the whole thing is part of a very worrying trend. I mean, look, if you look at any war, imagine if we had, when we were fighting the Second World War, imagine if you had 24/7 coverage of the sufferings of German civilians to try to undermine our support for the war here. I mean, how would that have ended up? At the end of World War II, many multiples more civilians were killed on the German side than on our side. Did that make it a wrong thing to do? Does that make it an evil genocidal war? No. But we've seen that propaganda playing out here in the 24/7 news cycle and social media as well. And the media, I'm afraid, is playing a part, not necessarily wittingly, but is playing a part in that.
What do you think?
I agree with what Jake says. I mean, we can go over this. We talk about this every week, don't we? The lack of context, the way the narrative is presented, the isolated impact of imagery without telling the story. It is a problem, and it does, it is one of the reasons why perhaps there are people who sit in their armchairs and watch these things and make assumptions. Well, why isn't there a ceasefire? Why can't there be peace? Rather than a more sophisticated argument. But we've seen, I mean, the print media in Britain has been largely supportive and positive in quite an extraordinary way. Large sections of the print media. But the broadcast media, all too often, the narrative is wrong. The bias is inherent. And the presentation of the war is skewed and distorted. And that definitely gives Israel significant problems in terms of its reputation around the world. But in the end, we have to face up to the fact that a lot of this is institutional, inherent anti-Semitism. And it's very, very hard for us, I think, to acknowledge that and to accept that. But it is the case. I mean, we haven't spoken tonight about the behavior of the Secretary General of the United Nations. I mean, absolutely shocking that somebody holding one of the great offices, one of the great global offices that's meant to be bringing people together, healing, bridge building, finding solutions, has been so dangerous and damaging and reckless in his contributions. Now, all of that's deliberate. And all it highlights, all it exposes is that if you forget the UN Security Council and you look at the United Nations as an institution, and people talk about institutional racism, it is institutionally anti-Semitic. There is no question about it. It's institutionally anti-Semitic. So Israel does face many, many barriers and many hurdles. How many people watching this imagery realize that Israel is the size of Wales? How many people watching this realize that Iran dictates every move that Hamas and Hezbollah make? They are not independent entities who make their own decisions. I'm afraid to say probably the majority of people making judgments about this conflict do not have access to the facts.
Okay, is there anything to add?
Oh, I agree with you. I mean, I think that, I mean, it's the extent to which Iran was involved in October the 7th and is involved in with Hamas's operations is a fascinating one and a complex one. But you're right. I mean, people don't know about it. I think that the what you talked about the print media versus broadcast media and the difference in alignment there. Of course, excluding the Guardian, which I think fewer people read that than read the JC, to be honest. So let's forget about that. But I think really it represents again a left-right divide. You know, there's some polling that came out a few weeks ago towards the beginning of the conflict by YouGov that showed that the public on the whole was quite evenly split with sympathy. About, I think, 21% of the public were supportive of Israel and 17% supportive of the Palestinians. But then, and the rest either didn't know or felt neutral. But then when you drilled down and looked at it in terms of Labour voters against Tory voters, amongst Tory voters, there was something like 37% were pro-Israel and 6% were for the Palestinians. But Labour voters was something like 27% were pro-Palestinian, and I think 9% were pro-Israel. So there was almost a mirror image on the left and on the right. It's become such a heavily politicized issue. It's extraordinary. I think that really goes a long way to explain the difference in the media emphasis. The right-wing press is very pro-Israel, but the broadcasters on the whole are, even though they might superficially be impartial, are staffed a lot of the time by people who are liberal or on the left. And so that bias does tend to come through on TV, which is, after all, still the mass media.
Okay, brilliant. Thank you so much for coming on, Jake. Thank you for coming on, Evan.